Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to give it just another couple of minutes for people to hop on, but we'll get started shortly. Thanks.
Oops. I have video.
Other one.
I'm going. Jesus, hold on, peeps. Audio. Mute my audio. I don't want to mute my audio.
Hi, everybody. All right, it's the top of the hour, so I think we will get started. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. We're going to go over just a few housekeeping items before we get started. My name is Chelsea Hoy, one of the lobbyists for the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking and Slavery at the Iowa State House. As an FYI, we will be recording the program so that we can send around an email afterwards for everyone who was unable to attend today. We plan to take questions at the end of the presentation, but I will be monitoring the chat box. So feel free to drop any questions you have throughout the program there, and we'll end the program with those questions. Please take a moment to make sure that you're muted unless you're speaking. So the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking, or NAHT, as I refer to it, is Iowa's first and remains the only statewide volunteer organization devoted exclusively to ending human trafficking in all forms. NAHT believes that human trafficking is modern-day slavery, where vulnerable people are forced and coerced into involuntary servitude for the financial profit of traffickers. I'm now going to turn things over to Teresa Davidson, who is a board member on the NAHT and co-founder and CEO of Teens Interrupted, which is a nonprofit that contends for the freedom of youth from human trafficking and exploitation, located in Cedar Rapids. Teresa was also appointed by the president to serve on a public-private partnership advocacy council to end human trafficking, a group of 11 leaders from around the nation serving to advise policy at the federal level. Teresa, please take it away.
All right. Well, it is very much an honor to present to you today. So welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to share my screen. And can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So we're going to be talking today about what Iowa legislators need to know about human trafficking. And why is this important for legislators to discuss about human trafficking? Because it's a very large growing problem in our state. We can no longer ignore. You are in a unique position to remove certain barriers that exist in assisting those victimized and help provide the justice that they deserve. You have the power to make a critical difference in the future for numerous Iowans. And there are several critical legislative changes that are needed urgently. So Shared Hope International launched the Protected Innocence Challenge project in 2011, which released report cards for states with grades assigned for laws the state had for criminal provisions on human trafficking. So in 2011, Iowa was ahead of most of the states in the nation who received an F grade, as many states' laws failed to even recognize that child sex trafficking was a crime at that time. We received a D grade in 2011, but by 2019 had raised that grade to a B thanks to you all enacting legislation aimed at holding offenders accountable and protecting survivors. By 2019, most states received an A or B grade. So in 2020, Shared Hope released a new advanced legislative framework for 2021 meant to challenge states to take the next step in the fight against human trafficking, focusing on protecting those victims. So this is Iowa's report card for 2023. And as you can see, we didn't do so well. Although we have raised our grade by 7 points since 2021, anything under 60 points is a failing grade. So while I show you this data and grade, it's not about raising the grade for us. It's about providing protection and services for those victimized by human trafficking. Included in the report cards are recommendations, including thorough rationale and very helpful drafting considerations. And so I would encourage each of you to review Iowa's report card in more detail. Chelsea will put the link in the chat for you, and it will also be emailed to you after the presentation. So as mentioned in this webinar, I will discuss ideas for priority legislation that we believe will make a critical difference for Iowa's most vulnerable. But before we go any further, let's define what it is that we're actually talking about. So what is human trafficking? We find the answer to this in Iowa Code 710A, and the link to this will also be put in the chat for you. This is the definition of human trafficking by Iowa Code 710A, but let's look at this definition in the AMP model form. So action means purpose. The action is if someone would induce or recruit, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain someone by means of force, fraud, or coercion, and we're going to unpack those here in a second, for the purpose of commercial sex or labor services. And there's a caveat here with minors, because minors induced into commercial sex are human trafficking victims, regardless if force, fraud, or coercion is present. An example of, I often think about force as physical force. For example, someone kidnapping someone, holding a knife to their throat, a gun to their head, drugging them into submission. An example of force is a woman who came into an emergency room in Iowa, stating that she'd been held in the back of a semi truck with many other women, all zip tied and drugged. When the semi stopped at a truck stop, the trafficker opened the back door to check on them, and when it closed, that door failed to latch. So she was able to open it and roll out. She rolled under another nearby semi and hid until the traffickers drove off. She then asked for help, and people brought her to the emergency room. Fraud is lying, manipulating, tricking someone. We often see that in relationships. Someone pretends to be a romantic partner, pretends to be their best friend, pretends to be this new family that they just found. And for labor trafficking, it's a fraudulent employment ad or fake job offer. So this is kind of like the woman that I worked with who thought that she was in a romantic relationship. Her boyfriend told her that he had gotten into some serious trouble with some loan sharks and needed money fast, and asked her to sell herself just this once to prevent him from being beaten or worse by those loan sharks. He told her it was the only way, and it was for them. She did it to protect him, and then everything changed. She found out he did this to other girls too. It wasn't just this one time, and she was sucked into a life of being sold without her consent while he controlled the money. I think coercion is one of the reasons that human trafficking is so incredibly complex, because this involves psychological persuasion, threats, intimidation, guilt, shame, loyalty. Like the woman that I worked with, I worked with an adult male who stated he had been sold for sex by his family since he was 3 years old. He didn't even know that this wasn't normal until he was in his 30s. It's all he knew. His family kept telling him, his family kept him in a life of trafficking through guilt and shame, telling him it was his duty to provide for the family. It was his role, and he should be ashamed if he didn't do his part. Loyalty, not wanting to leave his family or get them into trouble, kept him there as well. This is a powerful tool developed by the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We don't have time to go over it in detail, in this short webinar, but I did want to have you to have a link to it in the chat. It just shows many of the tactics traffickers use to groom and control the people that they victimize. So what if the person victimized is a minor? Federal law defines any commercial sexual act with a minor as human trafficking. A commercial sex act is any sex act. It doesn't have to be intercourse. We often think of people exchanging sex acts for money, but while anything of value can be money, it can also be things like food, clothing, shelter, transportation, drugs, and more. A link to this law is being placed in the chat for your reference as well. Iowa law also defines any commercial sex act with a minor as human trafficking, although there is one small loophole that we need to amend, which I'll describe later in this presentation. So we all know that a sex act with a minor is abuse, but a sex act with a minor plus payment is human trafficking. Therefore, there is no such thing as a child prostitute, and that is extremely important to understand. So what if there's no trafficker? I worked with a 15-year-old girl who wanted to buy an iPad. She ended up selling herself for $200 so that she could make the money to put towards it. She asked me, I wasn't a virgin anyway, so what's the big deal? There was no third-party controller like a pimp or a trafficker. So is this still human trafficking? Yes. Why? Because it was a minor involved in a commercial sex exchange. In this case, the buyer can be charged as a trafficker. And their ignorance of the age of a victim or the belief that the victim was older is not a defense to a violation of this section. Human trafficking is a very complex problem, and because it's the result of other social injustices, including not limited to poverty, gender inequality, racism, homelessness, discrimination and bias, migration. It basically affects marginalized and vulnerable people disproportionately. So how does a trafficker obtain a victim? Well, first, they target someone. Now I need to stop a second and say that any one of us on this webinar fits the profile of someone victimized. We fit the profile of a buyer and we fit the profile of a trafficker. So we need to take our stereotypical views and things that we think we know and throw them out the window, because it can happen to anyone. So traffickers will target someone and then they try to gain their trust because they want to know what it is that they need, because their goal is to fill that need. Do they need a place to stay? Do they need love and affection? Do they need drugs? They will fill that need, and their goal is to be the only one that fills that need, the only one that gets them, the only one that understands them, the only one that can provide for them. And in that way, they work toward isolating them, either physically isolating them or socially isolating them by breaking down all of the good relationships that they have already and replacing them with themselves. Again, they want to be the only one. They want to be that savior. When they have them in that very dependent relationship, that is when things change, as in our example before, and the abuse begins, and that is a very effective way for them to maintain control. It can be very difficult to remember the long list of vulnerabilities and signs of human trafficking, so I developed this easier list to remember. It's just 4 things, but if you remember these 4 things, you will be able to identify the vast majority of cases. The first 2 are vulnerabilities. Worth, how you feel about yourself. A lot of the other vulnerabilities, like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, are a root cause of their low self-worth. Desperation, as an example, if someone is addicted to substances, it makes them desperate for them, and they can be manipulated into doing just about anything to get them. And this is why traffickers often will purposefully cause those that they are victimizing to become addicted to substances. Another example is someone who is desperate for affection or love or attention, or desperate for money or safety and has to migrate. Desperation makes people extremely vulnerable to human trafficking. And the last 2 are signs. Change. Perhaps you see someone that you used to get good grades and outgoing and active in school activities that are now getting poor grades and acting withdrawn and sullen. Maybe you see a change in their group of friends. Control. When someone appears to be controlling someone else's life, They answer for them, they make decisions for them, control where they go, who they see, etc. Although we could spend hours talking about just this one topic, you should know that the #1 place that traffickers are grooming people today is online. And I want to take the time just right now to thank you for passing certain legislation this year to protect people from online abuses. And we can't forget about labor trafficking, because we have a growing child labor trafficking problem in Iowa. And the side describes it in brief that people in other countries that are desperate for economic freedom or freedom from gangs or violence are paying vast amount of money to get people to bring their child to the United States for education and a job. They're charging them $15,000 US. Of course, they don't have that. They're giving up the deed to their family house, farm, and business. It is a long and dangerous journey. There are many reports of children even being killed along the way, let alone raped and beaten. Once the children get to the border, they have been given along the way a name of a sponsor, and they're giving those to the Border Patrol, who then call the sponsor. The sponsor claims the child, and the children are told to say, "This is my sponsor, we're related. This is my uncle, my aunt, my brother." Many sponsors are claiming multiple children. Sponsors then take the children to Iowa and put them to work. We're seeing this especially in the agricultural industry in Iowa. And I'm working with these kids as our other organizations in Iowa and legislators are involved as well. We're seeing them, we're meeting with them, and they're under the control of the traffickers and trapped in debt bondage. So I know it's really hard to believe that trafficking happens in our beloved state, but sadly it does. And the true numbers are really hard to come by, but we have these. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline had 178 people that they identified as being victimized in 2023 from Iowa. 27% of those that were identified are minors. The Iowa Victim Service Call Center received 301 calls identifying as human trafficking related in 2023. 11% of those were minors. And the Family Resources Crisis Line over in Eastern Iowa remarkably received 334 calls as of August 22nd of this year, with over 1 month to go in their fiscal year. When I worked as the anti-human trafficking coordinator at Mercy Medical Center, I received alone 93 referrals in 2023, 25% of them are minors. And we know that this is happening more and more because when we go out to give presentations to youth, every single time we do, someone comes forward and says, "I'm being victimized, I was victimized, I know somebody who is," etc. Unfortunately, no one really knows how many people are victimized in Iowa by human trafficking, but we all know that these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg because people don't know about the hotlines. They don't identify as being a victim of human trafficking. Maybe they're unable to call the hotline because they're under watch, under threat. They don't have a phone. Maybe they fear that no one can really help them. And law enforcement reports far fewer numbers about human trafficking than there actually are, in part because the arrests are made in human trafficking cases for other things like prostitution, assault, tax evasion, etc. Prosecution and conviction of traffickers is extremely difficult. So we have 3 legislative priorities. And the first is $1 million. We're requesting $1 million for a human trafficking victim service fund. As you can imagine, people victimized by human trafficking have many, many needs, some of which are very unique to being victimized by this specific crime. While some sexual assault and domestic violence programs incorporate serving survivors of human trafficking, this victim service fund would go to organizations providing residential housing programs solely or primarily geared to serving survivors of human trafficking. Iowa currently has 8 organizations that provide residential programs solely or primarily geared specifically for those unique needs of survivors of human trafficking. And they are listed on the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking website under Resources tab. And Chelsea's going to put a link to that website in the chat. So where are the residential programs solely providing geared specially for victims of human trafficking in Iowa. Well, we have Breaking Traffic located in Davenport, providing comprehensive services, including rapid rehousing to survivors of both labor and sex trafficking in Eastern Iowa. We have Dorothy's House located in Des Moines, a very comprehensive program providing immediate crisis services, long-term residential housing, and transition housing for participants who have completed the residential program. Garden Gate Ranch is a faith-based Christian organization near Des Moines, providing long-term and transitional housing for sexually exploited adult women with children under 5. Wings of Refuge, a Christ-centered 501c3 in Ames that provides long-term and transitional housing for sexually exploited adult women. The Freedom House, located near Pella, this long-term restoration home is licensed by the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services for services to minors affected by sex and/or labor trafficking. Youth and Shelter Services, headquartered in Ames with locations across the state, provides crisis services and transitional living for youth. YSS did have a federal grant for 8 apartments to specifically serve survivors of human trafficking, but the grant was lost. They are very grateful for state funding given towards the Ember Center, which will be opening this fall. Chains Interrupted, located in Cedar Rapids, sadly closed their housing program for adult women in May of this year due to funding, staffing, and a change in focus to serving youth. Lila Mae's House, located in Sioux City, provides restoration housing for adult female survivors of sex trafficking. Lila Mae's House had to close for a while last year due to funding. Praise God, it has reopened due to extreme sacrifices of its founder. Friends of the Family, headquartered in Waverly, they were able to provide comprehensive case management and housing to survivors of human trafficking until a grant was lost. They now provide emergency shelter and rapid rehousing for survivors of human trafficking, among other crimes, and refer out for case management. So we'll put them half back on the map. So a couple of things to note is, as you can see, most of the services are located in central Iowa. While over 15% of the state's population lives in Polk County, there is a need to extend services into the other parts of the state. There's a critical need for immediate crisis services specifically for those victimized by human trafficking. The annual operating budget of the 5 restoration homes I listed on this map vary from $266,000 to $850,000, depending on a variety of factors, including the number of people they are able to serve and whether they offer crisis or transition housing. Dorothy's House is incorporating crisis services in the upcoming year after offering them in a pilot program. And this is going to raise their annual operating expenses by roughly $375,000. The average cost of running these homes is roughly $548,000 per year. 80 to 90% of this is salaries for the employees who care for their participants. Most of the funding for these homes is raised through private donors. One of the greatest challenges we have in this is to raise funding for salaries. People like to give to new projects, especially brick and mortar projects. Salaries are much, much more difficult. One of these restoration homes operated at a $45,000 loss in 2023, but remains open so far. Funding the Human Trafficking Victim Service Fund could make the difference whether this house or others has to shut their doors. The second legislative priority is last year, Representative Pelosi introduced House Study Bill 746 as an extension of many conversations that occurred during the fall 2023 Interim Human Trafficking Study Committee. While the bill was unanimously supported by its House subcommittees, there was not enough time to advance it through the process. So this year, we are recommending a similar bill be sponsored and passed, including directing the Iowa Office to Combat Human Trafficking to hold an annual meeting of stakeholders to develop legislative proposals to combat human trafficking and submit a report to the Governor and General Assembly for the next 5 years. Extending the civil statutes of limitation for sexual abuse or human trafficking of a minor to 5 years after the victim has reached 18 years. Requiring the Department of Health and Human Services to develop a plan to increase the availability of restoration facilities and protective services to juvenile victims of human trafficking, and allocating funding to create a joint unit involving the Iowa Attorney General's Office and the Iowa Office to Combat Human Trafficking for the purpose of investigating and prosecuting human trafficking cases. I know that there's been some strong responses to previous attempts to pass a safe harbor law, so I just want to break it down a little because safe harbor simply refers to laws that protect juvenile victims of human trafficking from being criminalized for their own victimization, directing them towards protective services instead. In Iowa, children are involved in commercial sex are generally treated as victims of human trafficking rather than criminals. However, there have been instances where children have been arrested and detained for prostitution, especially when a child will not or cannot identify a third-party controller, like a pimp or a trafficker. It is imperative that a child not have to identify a third party in order to be identified as a child sex trafficking victim under Iowa law. Children rarely recognize that they are victims of human trafficking. The child thinks they're in a romantic relationship, friendship, or part of a new family. They are also under threats to not disclose the relationship or identity of the trafficker. When a state requires the identification of a controlling third party, many children go unidentified as victims of human trafficking. Without this critical step, they can be criminalized for their victimization, not receive necessary services, be forced to serve as victim witnesses, and more. So we saw this part of the Iowa Code 710A before, and it has an appropriate definition of a child victim. However, within the definition of services, a third-party controller, pimp or trafficker, is necessary. So we humbly suggest amending 710A by simply deleting a small portion to eliminate that third-party control. I bring this up simply because it's such an easy fix to solve a potentially large problem. And the last suggestion I'll make within safe harbor legislation is about making sure children who are victimized by human trafficking are identified. Screening children is critical as they don't self-identify, and human trafficking is easy to miss and misidentify. We would love it if Iowa would join the 30 other states in the nation who have enacted this legislation to protect children. Wow, we went over quite a bit of information. 30 minutes goes really fast. There is so much more. I just want to end this by recognizing all the hard work that you have already done and thanking you for the important legislation that you've already passed. I mean, you raised Iowa's grade by those 7 points by requiring convicted offenders of sex trafficking and CSEC to pay fees, by extending foster care services, by providing protections for child sex trafficking victim witnesses. And just this year, the entire state cheered when you increased the penalties for traffickers, especially those trafficking children last year. And just this year, you added human trafficking to the wording of eligibility to existing victim service funding, made it a crime to use AI to generate porn, made it a crime for any person 18 years or older to disseminate or publish AI generated pornography, and required the court to determine when a person convicted of human trafficking shall first become eligible for parole and work release at the time of sentencing. Thank you so very much for your hard work on that. So in closing, I would just leave you with this quote from one of my favorite abolitionists, William Wilberforce. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, want to draft or sponsor a bill, please don't hesitate to contact me or the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking Board Chair, John Chesser, or legislative advocates, Chelsea Hoy and Therese Harms. All the links I mentioned in the webinar are listed here as well. And on the behalf of the network, advocates, and survivors across the state, we thank you for caring about this issue and attending today. Thank you to Chelsea and Therese for all their hard work in arranging this webinar, and I look forward to working with each of you in the future. And I know we don't have very much time for questions, but we have a few minutes.
Yes, thank you so much, Teresa. This has been a lot of information. Yes, if anyone has any lingering questions that they would like to get clarification on, feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat box, and we can take a few minutes to answer some questions.
I have been accused of being a fire hose of information before. It's a little overwhelming sometimes.
One of the first questions, Teresa, that I saw in the chat box is why did Iowa's score drop? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Why did Iowa's support drop?
Iowa's score drop.
Oh, it dropped because they changed their focus from criminal provisions to supporting victims. And so while we had raised our grade in the criminal provisions, there's more work to be done supporting the victims. Great question.
Yes, Representative Graber, we are recording this video, and we're going to share it out in an follow-up email after this. So you can go back and rewatch it if you'd like.
I think
Representative
Representative Golding.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there were several, as you were showing where the services were, that lost their grants. Are those grants still available? Is it because they lost personnel? Why did they lose their grants, and are they still available for them to reconsider?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends on the particular situation. So there are some of the grants that were no longer available because funding was cut at the state and federal level, especially the state level. And then there's a lot that goes into grants. There's a lot of requirements that are difficult to meet sometimes, and a lot of reporting requirements. For us, part of the reason that we lost our grant was because it was a very small amount of money, and the amount of reporting that we had to do outweighed. We were spending more trying to get the grant reported on than it was worth. So
I find that common in business too.
yeah.
Kelsey, could you take the slide down so we could see people when they speak? Great, thanks. I could add to the answer with the grant that was lost. These are federal grants specifically for services to victims and survivors of human trafficking, and they're very competitive. YSS had that grant, had 8 beds for transitional living for up to 2 years, and they had to compete again after 2 years, and they didn't score as well.
Oh, go ahead.
The federal monies are tough, very tough to come by.
I just had a comment about why our grades are lower across most every state. When I was living in Hawaii, Shared Hope International was working on making some changes to more accurately reflect how states were really doing. On paper, it looked good, but in reality, they were not implementing some of the policies and changes that they had put in place in writing. So now Shared Hope is requiring that states verify that they're actually doing the things that are in there, that follow policies and recommendations. So that was a big change, and everyone's grades dropped significantly. At one time, I think Iowa had a B, I think it was. And, then we dropped to an F because basically we had some things, in writing, but we weren't actually following through with those things and implementing them.
That's a great point, Melody. Thank you.
Melody, we've talked about this before. This is Mark Thompson. The Attorney General recently announced her formulation of a task force with respect to cold case files. And from a statutory level and from a elected official level, I honed in on one of her comments that she was fulfilling a campaign promise to establish such a task force. It struck me then that there has to be a political imperative sometimes to get things done. And this has to become a political imperative. We passed that legislation that you noted, increasing penalties. We had a grooming bill. We had several others, and they all were unanimous. There wasn't anybody that said this is a bad idea. When I clicked on the site for the cold case file on the AG's website, it popped up, and several of the cases were in fact human trafficking cases. So there's an opportunity there, and as we've spoken about it, I intend to push that. I've talked to the AG's office. I've talked to the Department of Public Safety. They even called me the other day about the grooming bill we passed this year and whether or not that individual who would be convicted of a Class D felony would be put on the list of sexual predators. And I was somewhat embarrassed to say I didn't know, but I didn't think so. But the point is, and I told her during that phone call, the legislative liaison, that I would be promoting and pushing a bill that would again form a task force focused solely on this, because you talk about the victims and the unique aspects of those victims, more unique than probably any other victim of any other crime, and it's going to take a special investigator and a special prosecutor to bring people to justice and understand that it's going to be a long haul to get any victim to actually testify, and to get them to testify in a place where they feel as comfortable as possible. So that will be work this year, I can assure you. Thanks.
Thanks for your comments, Representative Thompson. I know one of the things and one of the challenges that we've been faced with at the State House when it comes to particularly making changes to 710 or addressing the safe harbor legislation, it has been the Department of Public Safety not wanting to recognize the need to treat the victims separately, right, or differently, treating them as a victim as opposed to a criminal in that stance. And so that's been one of the biggest challenges. So I just want to acknowledge that on this call as well. We did have, before you came into the legislature, had passed safe harbor legislation unanimously through the House chamber, and then it stalled in the Senate. And so I just with opposition from the Department of Public Safety. And so I know that there's a different philosophy about how to treat human trafficking victims in that space and how to handle them. And so we would just encourage everybody when they're having conversations with the Department of Public Safety to continue to encourage them to look at the how we treat the victims in this space and not as criminals. That has been where the rubber has hit the road, or where we continue to have differences in how we might be able to actually make a difference. We can pass a lot of laws when it comes to human trafficking, but we're really, the Network Against Human Trafficking is really trying to bring forward meaningful legislation that will actually make a difference, that we've seen make a difference in other states. But if we're not willing to pass those pieces of legislation, then we're never going to be able to see and provide appropriate funding. We're never going to see the progress that we really need to make in this space. So we appreciate everybody's efforts. But at the end of the day, there are meaningful laws that will make a difference. And we really hope that those that are policymakers or are running for office that are on this call today will give sincere consideration to those that we're offering, because they've been they've been brought forward because they have made a difference in other states, or we know that they provide success in reducing those numbers or providing services to those victims.
All right, are there any other questions before we wrap things up? All right, I'm not seeing anybody jump out. I just want to thank you all again for taking the time and joining us today for this really important presentation. Like I said, I will follow up with an email with all these resources and contact information. If something does come up and you want to ask further questions, we encourage that, please. And we look forward to working with you in the 2025 legislative session. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.